Japan rose from the ashes of World War II. It grew into the world's second largest economy thanks to the diligence of its people and the strong bonds between management and workers. But the situation changed drastically in the 1980s as Japanese people devoted themselves to the money game. They began zealously pursuing wealth. The real estate and stock markets shot up, creating a bubble. The pursuit of riches extended abroad. But then suddenly the bubble burst. And a prolonged period of stagnation set in. It's been called the lost 20 years. What created the bubble and what fueled its expansion? And what prevented Japan's economy from pulling itself out of the lost decades? Interviews with more than 100 people who helped shape the era reveal the truth about Japan's drastic economic rise and decline.
Deep down inside, we knew we were going overboard. But we didn't stop because things were going so well.
We are the culprits behind the growth of the bubble. There were steps we should have taken.
We didn't realize Chinese companies had grown as much as they had.
The bubble and the lost 20 years. We'll take a look at what was happening to Japan and its people as the global economy went through a drastic change after the 1980s. This is a program from 1986 that focused on an entrepreneur who became famous for his aggressive investment strategy.
世界の金融業者の間で北マネーの異名を取る人物がいました。
Shigeru Kita was president of a company called Hanwha. His fame extended well beyond Japan. The company's main business was in steel and metals, but it was heavily investing in stocks and other financial instruments. The firm set up a trading room next to the president's office. Hanwha made an enormous amount of money investing in the global financial markets using every available resource.
今日は1日でどのぐらい儲けたんでしょう。
1億ぐらいじゃないかな。
1億ドル。
うん、1億円。
1億円
にしてな。いや大したことない。
大したことない今日は。
5億儲かることもあるし。だけど楽な商売ですよ。ね。
Kita launched his company with two brothers in 1947, shortly after the end of the war. He was determined to rise from the ruins of post-war Osaka. The company produced this film to mark Hanwha's 30th anniversary. Steel was a pillar of Japan's booming economy, and Hanwha found great success as a distributor. It had about 30 bases in Japan and abroad and employed more than 1,000 workers. Sincerity and diligence was one of the company's slogans. Kuniaki Shintaku was an executive at Hanwha. He saw how the company reshaped itself in the image of its president.
The first thing we did was take down all the slogans on each floor and replace them with banners, calling on everyone to put a priority on making profits.
Behind the president's shift were drastic changes in Japan's economic situation. These were triggered by the oil shock of the 1970s. Conflict in the Middle East prompted Arab oil-producing countries to raise the prices of crude oil. The surge in crude oil prices dealt a serious blow to Japan, which relied on the Middle East for most of its petroleum supplies. Commodity prices spiked rapidly, casting a shadow on its economy. There was little prospect for a further rise in demand for steel. Hanwha's sales from its main business had been rising steadily since the company was founded. But in the 1980s, growth had stalled. How could the firm return to profitability? Kita took up this question during a talk he gave in 1981. We can no longer expect a big rise in profits based on sales. The question now is how to overcome the situation. Sales will stop growing and profits will decline. We have to come up with a plan to make up for it.
He said financial investments would help the company continue to grow. He warned us that without taking that kind of step, we'd be reduced to a mediocre firm, or even worse, a below-average company.
As Hanwha's main business struggled, Kita increasingly devoted himself to investing. Global financial markets were undergoing a drastic shift, and those changes began affecting Japan. It all started in the United States. Financial deregulation had enabled capital procurement from abroad, and that freed up interest rates. The U.S. was eagerly calling on Japan to follow suit. A former high-ranking official with the U.S. Treasury Department talked about the shift in policy.
To begin to diversify the Japanese domestic market so that Japanese investors had more choices for investment of their savings, which were very high. And so it was to try to get a broadening out of participation by financial firms in Japanese-related business.
The new investment methods made available by deregulation prompted Japanese companies to funnel money into the markets. Hanwha procured funds from overseas markets at interest rates lower than those in Japan. It put the money into savings accounts, stocks, and foreign currencies in Japan, which had higher interest rates and allowed the company to make a profit. Hanwha poured more and more money into this side business. In 1989, 5 years after the project began, its financial operations were earning more than twice as much profit as its steel operations. One company was deeply involved in the swelling of Hanwha's coffers. Yamaichi Securities was one of Japan's major securities firms. It later went bankrupt and became a symbol of the excesses of the bubble. This footage from 1985 shows the company's inside workings. The stock market began taking on an unsettling liveliness. NHK has discovered an undisclosed document from this period that details the company's transactions and the actual testimony of its executives. It shows the firm and Hanwha repeatedly engaged in an illegal practice called nigiri. The scheme is designed to prevent customers from incurring losses by guaranteeing them profitable returns. Yamaichi used such promises to attract big business from Hanwha. What led Yamaichi to take part in this type of illegal scheme? Hiroyasu Ishihara was head of Yamaichi's stock brokerage. He later became the company's vice president. In his first interview with the media, he spoke about what motivated the company. He told us financial deregulation had led to fierce competition among stockbrokers to win customers.
We wouldn't have had a problem if we had engaged only in normal business. But there was this competition. Deep inside, we knew we were going overboard, but we didn't stop because things were going so well. Back then, reprimanding fellow workers or saying no was utterly unthinkable.
Around that time, something unusual was also happening in a prime residential district in the heart of Tokyo. Kitaro Watanabe began his career as a car dealer, but expanded into real estate.
This is where I started.
He owned parking lots in central Tokyo. In the late 1980s, banks began approaching him with offers of massive loans.
They kept telling me they could lend more and urged me to spend more. It was the bank's money, not mine, but even so, I used it to increase my assets. I had never been that eager to make a lot of money in the market. It was just the natural course of events.
Financial deregulation was the trigger here, too. Before then, banks made a profit by lending to companies. But after regulations were eased, many businesses were able to procure funds directly from financial markets. That forced banks to cultivate new borrowers. They set their eyes on the real estate industry, which was enjoying a boom thanks to rising land prices. Watanabe used bank loans to buy more than 100 plots of land in central Tokyo. He even bought a golf course. At one point, his assets topped $4.8 billion.
I bought 3,000 square meters of land to build a house on. The property had a guest house, a swimming pool, and a tennis court. I made it my home. It really was a high time.
The more banks extended loans, the more land prices surged. Stock prices rose as well. Over a period of 4 years, the market tripled in value. Japan was entering an era of unprecedented economic growth. It was flooded with money, and all that cash transformed the Japanese people. Gold was all the rage. Noodles flecked with gold leaf became a hit. And even sushi rolls got the treatment. A gold bar worth more than $750,000 became a center of attention. One insurance firm bought Van Gogh's famous painting Sunflowers at an auction for the staggering price of nearly $40 million. And so began a shopping spree for the world's masterpieces. One real estate company spent $1.3 billion on New York's landmark Rockefeller Center.
It's your money. You can do what you want with it. If they want to sell it to you and they're willing to take the money, I don't care. Well, it's nothing new. Japanese are buying everything in New York City now. But I hope we could buy back a couple of companies in Japan.
Another consumer electronics firm bought a major Hollywood film studio for $3.4 billion.
From ABC News.
The extravagance of the Japanese people made headlines around the world.
In the past year, Japanese investors have bought up everything from Burger Kings to golf courses. They now own most of the hotels along famed Waikiki Beach.
They believed the good times would never end. Only later did they realize that they were in the midst of a bubble. A former executive of the Bank of Japan regrets the failure of policymakers to contain the bubble, even though they detected the signs early on. He agreed to speak with us. Ryoji Tsukuda was an executive director at the BOJ in the late 1980s. He says the rapid changes taking place at home and abroad hindered officials from dealing with the bubble as quickly as they should have.
We tell each other we were the culprits behind the growth of the bubble. Why couldn't we have been more decisive? But we can only say these things in retrospect.
In effect, policymakers at the Bank of Japan allowed the bubble to swell. It all started with the Plaza Accord in 1985. 5 developed countries agreed to a demand by the U.S. to begin coordinated efforts to weaken the dollar. Prompting the move was the ballooning U.S. budget deficit. In the 1980s, Japanese manufacturers were enjoying a golden age, as seen in a newly coined phrase, Japan as #1. Japanese consumer electronics took the global market by storm. Japan surpassed the U.S. in car sales to become the world's largest auto producer. As a result, many American automobile factories were forced to shut down. An influx of Japanese goods aggravated the friction between the two countries. People in the U.S. became increasingly critical of Japan. Officials in Washington increased pressure on Japan to strengthen the yen and introduce monetary easing measures. Here's the thinking. A stronger yen drives up the cost of imports from Japan. That should put a brake on the inflow of Japanese goods. And if Japan introduces monetary easing when the yen is strong, more money will flow into the Japanese economy, stimulating growth. That would allow the U.S. to expand exports to Japan. We spoke with a former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board who was one of the engineers of the Plaza Accord.
Japan was going to become the strong new economy in the world. Japan #1. Japan industry was greatly admired during that period for its competitiveness or its efficiency. To exaggerate that our industry would be overwhelmed by Japanese now.
A Japanese official who participated in the negotiations admits that Japan had no choice but to accept Washington's demands.
They stressed that we were under their nuclear umbrella. I knew only too well that Japan was able to strengthen its economic might thanks to the protection the U.S. military provided under the Japan-U.S. alliance. I felt strongly that we had to conclude the agreement.
In January 1986, 4 months after the Plaza Accord, the Bank of Japan implemented monetary easing policies. The measure was carried out by lowering the official discount rate. Policymakers lowered the rate in January, March, and April. The official rate is the interest applied when the central bank lends funds to other financial institutions. When the rate is lowered, money flows more easily to other banks, and the volume of funds in the market increases.
この1年間に1平方メートルあたり67万円余りだった土地の価格が133万円とほぼ2倍になりました。異常な上がり方です。
The BOJ repeatedly lowered interest rates over a short period. This increased the investment banks made in real estate and boosted the rise in land prices. Former BOJ Executive Director Tsukuda says it was around this time that a sense of caution intensified within the central bank.
The aggressive activities of financial institutions were starting to attract notice. We all realized that, at the very least, the official discount rate should not be lowered any further. That was the widespread understanding at the bank.
But even though they realized that abnormal loans were being extended to the real estate industry, policymakers continued to lower interest rates. once again, this was done at the prompting of the United States. In September 1986, Japan's finance minister, Kiichi Miyazawa, met with U.S. Treasury Secretary James Baker. Miyazawa said he wanted to protect Japan's export industry by putting a stop to the appreciation of the yen. But Baker replied that the U.S. trade deficit was not shrinking and demanded that interest rates be lowered further. The BOJ was pressed to act, but some policymakers raised their voices against further interest rate cuts. The leading proponent was the BOJ's vice governor, Yasushi Mieno, who had spent his career at the bank. NHK has acquired internal BOJ documents detailing Mieno's views about the debate. They describe how he offered suggestions to the bank's governor, Satoshi Sumita, who was from the finance ministry and had executive authority. Mieno was adamant that the interest rate should not be lowered.
The surge in land prices in central Tokyo is astounding. Trading in precious metals and financial instruments are gradually becoming more active. Given these economic conditions, it wouldn't be proper to lower the discount rate.
But 1 month later,
金融政策面でももう一段の金利の引き下げを図ることが先行きの内需拡大、内需振興にとってより有効であると。
Sumita decided to lower the rate again. On the same day, Finance Minister Miyazawa announced a deal he had reached with U.S. Treasury Secretary Baker. The U.S. would keep the yen's appreciation in check, and in exchange, Japan agreed to lower interest rates.
これ以上の円高はないということについての合意ということですね。
Mieno said he had not been informed in advance about the interest rate cut.
We didn't know about this. We don't know much about what Miyazawa and Sumita discussed. In any case, the BOJ didn't cut the rate because of domestic factors, but out of consideration for a foreign country.
And then, the bank was hit by an unexpected incident in the United States. In October 1987, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. The day came to be known as Black Monday.
It was just going down and down and down, never stopped.
Share prices plunged, and the effects rippled from the U.S. to Japan and across the globe. If central banks raised interest rates at such a delicate time, they would run the risk of dampening the economy. That could cause turmoil in financial markets. So the BOJ was forced to abandon the idea of raising interest rates.
Everything underwent a dramatic change on Black Monday. Especially in terms of the official discount rate. Everyone became timid. And raising rates was not even discussed.
For over 2 years, the Bank of Japan maintained low interest rates. It finally raised them in May 1989. In December of that year, the bubble hit its peak, and the Nikkei index topped 38,000 yen. But the very next month, share prices took a turn. They finally started to fall. Hanwha had been investing heavily in the markets and sustained massive losses. That led to the resignation of President Shigeru Kita. Yamaichi Securities was engaged in the illegal nigiri scheme to acquire new customers.
私らが悪いんであって社員は悪くありませんから。
The company continued to hide its losses and was forced into bankruptcy.
We should have sat down and talked about the proper way to manage our business, even if it took all night. We should have engaged in a real discussion with the president and told him what was really on our minds. I have many regrets about that, especially in light of what happened. The thinking at the time was to just deal with the problem halfway. And while we were doing that, the worst possible outcome occurred.
Land prices continued to plunge. That caused banks to reverse their positions. Prior to that, they had taken a cue from the central bank's interest rate hikes and the finance ministry's regulations. At one point, Watanabe had assets worth 700 billion yen. But with the collapse of the bubble economy, his company went bankrupt.
It was like a roller coaster. We surged up, and then, when the banks shut off the money flow, all of a sudden, we took a nosedive. I hated it. It was terrible. Absolutely awful.
After the collapse of the bubble, many financial institutions that had persisted with excessive lending went bankrupt. Some major department stores also fell victim to the downturn. Many companies were forced into hard times. Struggling firms implemented streamlining measures by restructuring their employee relations. Irregular employment increased, and social inequality became a serious issue. Prices continued to fall, and Japan experienced a long period of deflation. The prolonged slump has been referred to as the lost 20 years. In 2013, the name of an internationally renowned appliance maker disappeared in Japan. Sanyo Electric was a leading electronics manufacturer. Former chairman Satoshi Ioue granted NHK the first interview since his retirement. He spoke about how the company, which had a history lasting more than 60 years, just ceased to exist.
I always wonder if the name Sanyo is left anywhere at all. Even when I look around the streets, it's disappearing. I'll very much miss seeing something that until now has been out in the open.
What kind of fate befell Japanese companies that had spearheaded such strong economic growth? Sanyo Electric was founded in 1947, shortly after the end of World War II. Ioue's father established the business after breaking away from his brother-in-law, who had started the company now known as Panasonic. Sanyo's technological expertise propelled the company to great success. It commercialized Japan's first Jetstream-type washing machine. At the 1970 Osaka Expo, the company ran its own pavilion and showed off a futuristic appliance that would wash a person's entire body.
If I were ever to cook, I would use this wonderful Sanyo food thing.
In the 1980s, Sanyo aired this television commercial overseas. It had become one of the companies that spearheaded Japan's economic growth.
The Sanyo food thing, the browning, baking, broiling microwave oven.
Ioue was appointed president in 1986 and set a goal of establishing the company as a leading international firm. But his expectations were dashed by the rough waves of global competition. In the 1990s, South Korean electronics company Samsung transformed itself into an international conglomerate.
모든 물건을 싸게, 좋게, 빨리 잘 만드는 기업이 좋은 기업이다 이거예요.
Samsung's personnel training program was a big factor in its competitiveness. Ioue visited the company on an observation tour and was stunned by what he saw.
I heard that if someone wanted to be promoted to department head, they had to swim across the Han River. Not only did they need the physical strength to make it to the other side, but also the will. The sense of accomplishment after reaching the far bank is said to be indescribable. Training at Samsung didn't involve just studying. It improved the physical strength of employees and enriched their spirit.
Around the same time, China began its rise as a major player in the global economy. With a population of 1 billion citizens providing a cheap labor pool, the country came to be known as the world's factory. It was also around this time that Chinese company Haier began making a name for itself as one of the leading international appliance manufacturers. Ioue visited the firm in 2001. For more than 10 years, until just before his visit, he wasn't even aware that the company existed.
I didn't know anything about Haier. We let our guard down for a moment, and this Chinese company became huge. I wondered why we didn't realize this more quickly. It may have been that in the 80s, part of us were conceited about Japan being number one. Even if we didn't realize it at the time, I very much regret that.
Chinese and South Korean companies took Japanese businesses by surprise. Naoki Nishizawa was at the front line of washing machine sales at Sanyo. He says he was busy dealing with Japanese competitors.
I was engaged in businesses on the domestic side. I thought we'd eventually go back to having a strong market like before the collapse of the bubble. But manufacturers always had cost-cutting on their minds, and distributors and major discount retailers tried to procure products cheaper than their rivals. It was a constant war of attrition. That was Japan after the bubble. No one benefited from it.
As price competition intensified, manufacturers focused on adding new features to their appliances. Sanyo tried to stand out by adding different functions, such as making washing machines quieter or increasing their energy efficiency.
These were the needs of the Japanese market. Around 2005, when foreign manufacturers were talking about setting up a system of global standards, Japanese companies found out that all these added features weren't necessary. So we spent 20 years packing in these functions, but foreign companies didn't bother with them. That turned out to be a big difference.
The focus on adding new features weighed down the competitiveness of Japanese products. It made their goods more expensive compared to those from China and South Korea. This graph shows sales growth at Sanyo, Samsung, and Haier starting in 1993. Sanyo lags far behind, with Samsung expanding fivefold and Haier growing by an astounding 90 times. In the early 2000s, Japanese companies were overtaken by the world-changing technology coming out of Silicon Valley in the United States. Innovations in the field of information technology completely transformed the concept of production. New products from IT giant Apple became the global standard.
If you look at the reason that the iPod exists and that Apple's in that marketplace, it's because these really great Japanese consumer electronics companies who kind of owned the portable music market for a long, invented it and owned it, couldn't do the appropriate software, couldn't conceive of and implement the appropriate software, because an iPod's really just software.
Japanese consumers were said to have a very discerning eye when making decisions about what to buy. So we thought that if something is competitive in Japan, it would work globally too. This might have been true with hardware, but I think this changed dramatically when software was involved. I think we were focused too much on hardware.
Japanese businesses were struggling abroad and back home in Japan, fighting a constant war of attrition. Sanyo was forced to cut a large number of employees. This further depleted its strength.
Japanese companies had always valued their workers, but I think they later went too far with streamlining. They did things like asking employees to take voluntary retirement. The capable workers ended up quitting, and that had devastating results.
In 2012, Haier bought Sanyo's washing machine and refrigerator businesses. Nishizawa now oversees the Chinese company's washing machine division in Asia. He's grown painfully aware of the harsh climate that global businesses face.
I never thought I'd be working at Haier. I'm overwhelmed by how quickly Chinese companies make decisions. Japanese companies have their own negotiating methods, such as taking the time to lay the groundwork. But this is different from global standards, where people want to hear the answer right away.
Sanyo ultimately became a subsidiary of the Panasonic Group, and the brand name disappeared from Japan. It survives now only as the Buddhist name on the grave of Iue's father, who founded the company. Why couldn't the firm survive through the lost 20 years? Iue continued to ask himself this question even after his retirement.
Back then, I think everyone had the goal of catching up and surpassing the United States. But when Japan actually accomplished that and became known as number one, it might have meant the end of an era. I now regret that we were so stubborn. Japan and Japanese companies were told that they need to join global standards. We were operating in a capitalistic society, so we need to think about how to adapt our companies to conform with that reality.
Japanese businesses are still searching for ways to rise up out of the lost decades. These days, bubble economies are cropping up around the world with greater frequency. Monetary easing, which carries the risk of creating a bubble, has spread across the globe. Many countries face the task of how to control increasing volumes of money. Now, many countries are following Japan into an era of stagnation. The world is watching to see if Japan will learn from the bubble and the lost 20 years and figure out a way of making use of it in the future.